But by the time we've reached this moment of the death of God, we already have a strange change in the discourse. What new games, new festivals, what could be invented now to make up for what has already been destroyed? What myths could we construct ourselves? What games? What holy festivals? What interesting books? Fascinating arguments and new ways to live, other than the pathetic, tragic, stupid, banal array of ordinary, everyday, bourgeois thinking life. Surely we can do better than that.
Hello and welcome to the 172nd episode of the Diet Soap Podcast. The guest this week is the author and Professor Jodi Dean. Professor Jodi Dean teaches political theory at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York, and she recently blogged about a chapter from Gilles Dauvé and Francois Martin's book, The Eclipse and Reemergence of the Communist Movement. We discuss her blog entry and the book in this week's episode. It's Wednesday, February 13th, 2013, and I'm Douglas Lane, the host of the Diet Soap Podcast. This week, I want to thank Michael T. and Brandon F. for their one-time donations to the podcast, and I want to urge everyone listening to follow me on Facebook and join the new Diet Soap International Facebook group. The music you're listening to is Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and this is played in tribute to the late James DePriest, who was the music director for the Oregon Symphony from 1980 to 2003. James DePriest was a student of Leonard Bernstein, who was conducting in this piece, and a Portland icon. And he died on February 8th this year. In just a moment, you'll be listening to Jodi Dean and I discuss the subject of capitalism. Jodi Dean is a professor of political theory at Hobart and William Smith College in New York, and the author of several books, including Blog Theory and The Communist Horizon. Professor Dean recently blogged about the need for a radical party and a return to Leninism at her blog Eyesight, and that's the topic of conversation for today's podcast. Professor Dean, thank you for returning to Diet Soap.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thanks for having me. Also, please call me Jodi.
Okay, Jodi. So you've been blogging about the need for a return to the idea of a radical party and the kind of discipline that comes along with that form for a little while now. And I think that might be part of your book. I haven't read it yet, but is that in your book, The Communist Horizon? Is something that you...
Yes, the last chapter tries to think about Occupy Wall Street as giving us a new way to approach thinking about the party.
So today I thought we might talk about that specific thing and your blog post from the 15th of January. Now, it was a short blog post, and maybe this will be a short conversation, but you were responding to an essay by Gilles Dauvé. Am I saying that correctly?
I think it's pronounced Dauvé, but I don't know.
Gilles Dauvé and Francois Martin, called Leninism and the Ultra-Left.
Right.
And so to start with, how would you characterize those two poles, Leninism versus the Ultra-Left?
So let me say a little bit about what this text is and why I started to engage it. It's a chapter of a larger book. Let me see, what is the name of the larger book or larger text? That's called, Eclipse and the Reemergence of the Communist Movement. And this chapter, I think, was originally published in 1969, and the other components of it were put together in the early 1970s. And the reason and it's available on the libcom.org site and other places, but libcom.org is where I found it. And I started looking at it because it's different people who have been responding to some of my discussion of the party referred to Theyre and were saying, well, you need to look at this, you need to look at that, you need to look at endnotes and Theyre Communiste and Amadeo Bardiga and all these other people. And so I was like, okay, well, in a sort of a good faith gesture and comradely gesture, I'll try to start engaging some of these texts with which I'm not familiar. So that's why I went into it. And so this little blog post on Leninism and the ultra-left is just about this one chapter. In fact, actually right now I'm working on commentary on another one of the chapters from their pamphlet or their book. So this text by Theyre and Martin is one that is that's basically looking at the left, particularly the French left in the late 60s and early 70s, and saying, look, there's some different branches here, and the way the debate has tended to look, it's been the ultra-left against Leninist. And what they're going to try to do is suggest that both of these views are wrong and give at least a kind of proto-version of a third path. So, the Leninist path is one that emphasizes the Revolutionary Party, and the ultra-left position is really just a kind of councilist position, right? It's one that says that no, there shouldn't be a kind of extra political level on top of the workers, that any kind of revolutionary movement has to come from the workers themselves. And by that, they mean from within the factory, from workers' organizations within the factory. And that anything that tries to put some kind of political apparatus on top of that, anything that tries to lead the workers politically rather than following them within workers' organizations is basically wrong. And so the ultra-left, according to Theyre and Martin, are presenting their view as a contrast to Leninism. And Theyre and Martin say, look, this kind of this opposition is actually not great, right? We can do better than have one of these or the other. In fact, it's a form of non-action to just say, oh, the workers must decide for themselves. It's not the case that revolutionary theory and revolutionary politics are somehow separate from the workers' movement. So that's what they're trying to. They allow, in a way, something like a kind of party, though they're trying, I think, at the same time to distance themselves from the sort of communist parties that were available to them in the late 60s, early 70s in France.
Your summary was really very, very good, and you've gotten to the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you. But I think that this issue of whether to have a party or not have a party, whether the workers need an extra political apparatus on top of them, whether they can be spontaneously organized in councils. All of this is a problem that pops up in different ways throughout left thinking. So it's not only the question of the party. One way to think of it is also in terms of theory versus practice, or intellectual work as against physical labor, or even the difference between base and superstructure. That this opposition is an opposition that kind of plagues left thinking, and we keep trying to resolve it.
And I think the word plague is well chosen because, in fact, there's something that's sort of diseased and corrupt in thinking of these things as an opposition, particularly because I think these days we tend to, there's so much anti-Hegelianism that people don't tend to think of opposition as a kind of interior or internal relationship or dynamic, but in terms of like a standoff of two completely separate and not connected tendencies or ways of thinking or approaches. And here, I actually think Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, is really interesting and important when he describes, let's say, the relation between the economy and politics as a parallax, meaning that you're looking at the same thing from two slightly different directions that ultimately enfold or twist into one another. So, for example, you can't think about the economy without recognizing class struggle, which is political, and you can't think of politics without recognizing the economic dimensions that are always determining within it. So the same thing, if you have an opposition between theory and practice, in some weird way, that's assuming that our practice is not theoretically inflected, or there's no theory, or there's no practice already involved in the kinds of theorizations that we do. So I think all of these are always sort of much more intertwined. And in fact, that's always where the debate ends up, right? It's saying, okay, these things are intertwined. We have to recognize they're mutually imbricated. And somehow, in the context of movement, we tend to forget it and go back to the standoff again.
Yeah, they're intertwined, but weirdly so. Maybe I'm the weird one, okay?
Well, that's probably true.
But it just seems to me that if you try to figure out how theory and practice are intertwined, or how one is dependent on the other, you do get this kind of snake eating its own tail effect. And I've been reading, the phenomenology and trying to get a handle on this entwinement that is in the world, and in our society, certainly. If they're intertwined, they are intertwined as an opposition, and so it's no surprise that in our own thinking and actions that we should find these oppositions and points of disagreement too, since these are oppositional ideas. My problem is realizing that they're entwined hasn't gotten me very close to figuring out what to do, and like this issue of the party versus councils is not something I have at the moment any clear idea about. But I am seeing this. I'm more interested in this kind of opposition between intellectual work, physical labor, theory, practice, and trying to figure out this dialectic. And maybe if we can figure that out, maybe we'll get closer to figuring out the right form. And you seem to be more comfortable with it, so.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if it's because maybe I'm naive on this. I don't know if it's because I work as a theorist, right? That's my job, and so for me, that's the way my material life depends on this. At the same time, in politics, I have a few friends who are very militant workers in unions and very involved in militant politics. And they teach me all the time. Really important matters of thinking about the relationship of particular kinds of struggle to the environment. One of my friends recently wrote something where he was saying, just totally trashing something, some sort of Teamsters publication. So he just trashes them unmercifully, and then says, but it's much better to have a world and a movement and a workplace with the Teamsters than without them. And so I found this completely kind of helpful and smart. So, and sort of deeply implicated in political and economic struggle.
What you're saying there is, and I agree, if you're actually involved in the struggle, like involved in the union or and working on it consistently, maybe this doesn't come to you as much as a little logic puzzle or a crossword that you can't fill in the words on. And I understand that, but then right there again, it's like you're saying, well, you just got to fall on the side of practice. You got to fall on the side of struggle and on the side of the worker, and not on the side of the theory and trying to think it through because you see a contradiction between the Teamsters and real radical struggle, but because the worker who's involved, the real world, the physical is saying this is good, then you take it, like a good empiricist.
Or I recognize that it's not all or nothing, right? One can be very much involved in workplace struggles, but then also recognize, okay, what are the limits to work? This is good old, I think Lenin 101. You can get sucked into trade union consciousness and not go further. At the same time, that doesn't mean that you can dispense with trade union consciousness completely, right? Rather than kind of moving through it. So the practice matters. I think the key is kind of not totalizing either side, but recognizing how, of course, one already folds into the other.
Capitalism is, and this almost I'm tempted to say is what is great about it, although I'm very critical of it. Capitalism is more an ethical, religious category for me. It's not true when people attack capitalists as egotists, they don't care for. No, an ideal capitalist is someone who is ready again to stake his life, to risk everything just so that production grows, profit grows, capital circulates. His personal or her happiness is totally subordinated to this. This is what I think Walter Benjamin, the great Frankfurt School companion thinker, had in mind when he said capitalism is a form of religion. You cannot account for a figure of a passionate capitalist obsessed with expanded circulation, with the rise of his company in terms of personal happiness. I am, of course, fundamentally anti-capitalist, but let's not have any illusions here, What shocks me is that most of the critics of today's capitalism feel even embarrassed, that's my experience, when you confront them with a simple question. Okay, we heard your story, protest, horrible, big banks depriving us of billions, hundreds, thousands of billions of common people's money. Okay, but what do you really want? What should replace the system? And then you get one big confusion. You get either general moralistic answers like, people shouldn't serve money, money should serve people. Well, frankly, Hitler would have agreed with it, especially because he would say, when people serve money, money is controlled by Jews and so on, no? So either this or some kind of a vague Keynesian social democracy or a simple moralistic critic and so on and so on. So, it's easy to be just formally anti-capitalist, but what does it really mean? It's totally open. This is why, as I always repeat, with all my sympathy for Occupy Wall Street movement, its result was, I call it a Bartleby lesson. Bartleby, of course, Herman Melville's Bartleby, who always answered his favorite, I would prefer not to. The message of Occupy Wall Street is, I would prefer not to play the existing game. There is something fundamentally wrong with the system, and the existing forms of institutionalized democracy are not strong enough to deal with problems. Beyond this, they don't have an answer, and neither do I. For me, Occupy Wall Street is just a signal. It's like clearing the table. Time to start thinking.
We're a little short on time, and I want to move into my next question here. Let me think about how to do it. Okay, I'm just going to stick with the essay for a moment and say you came across a line that popped out at you and that you kind of commented on, and you broke it in half. So the first part of the line was, capitalist society itself produces a communist party. And then just to read the whole thing, it actually reads, which is nothing more than the organization of the objective moment. So capitalist society itself produces a communist party, which is nothing more than the organization of the objective moment. Now, taking the first half just up to how the capitalist society produces a communist party, how did you interpret that line?
So I interpreted this line in part in light of conversations I've been having with other people who are anti-party, and one of the responses is, to quote Theyre and say something like, well, capitalist society itself produces a communist party. And I'm thinking, well, that's actually a not very interesting thing to say. It's pretty obvious in that if we live in capitalist societies, there is no outside. There's nothing that is not produced already. within capitalist society. So it's not a criticism. That's like saying, I don't know, the church, the gang, sadomasochism, all of these are produced, within capitalist society. Like, yeah, no kidding, right? So there's nothing, so it's not really a theoretical point. It's just a kind of I guess I usually call it a monkey trick, right? A kind of rhetorical trick designed to disarm your opponent into not thinking. It's also, I think there's another way to say, though, is, okay, let's be more generous and say, well, this is the Marxist point that capitalism produces its own grave diggers. And so the party then is, when you say capitalist society produces a communist party, then that's a good thing, right? Because, yes, capitalism is not a formation that can hold on to itself. It produces its own overcoming. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what Dave and Martin mean.
Oh, but I do. But go on.
You do think that's what they mean?
I do, yeah. Especially as they move from that into value theory is their next thing. But go on to what you're going to say.
Oh, and then the third one, and this is where that one of the ways that I was interpreting them is that the party form is a political form that emerges within parliamentary democracies. And because they're writing in the late 60s, very early 70s, and they're criticizing the communist parties that have become part of the system, either in power or as a recognized resistance, they are, I interpreted them as rejecting the party as a element of a specifically parliamentary period in European history. And so to say that communist society itself produces a communist party, I thought was a way to say that it's a historical point about the party, and also a way to say that if we are not in that historical moment anymore, then maybe the party is not the kind of form that we need to be thinking about. But do you think they mean something else?
I think they mean the second thing. And I think that what you're saying, your third interpretation, isn't very far from your first. The difference is that it's more nuanced and detailed, but it's still saying, look, this is an historic, capitalism produced this form, and therefore it's actually going to buttress capitalism rather than threaten it. But and whether you say, and the third interpretation is interesting. What it might be saying is capitalism produced this, but now it's producing something else.
Yeah, that's right, which is how it could well be that I'm just reading that in light of what people have tried to do with this text rather than the text itself.
Right. Well, I think it's complicated. I think there may be both interpretations are in there. It's that dialectical thing, because on the one hand, yes, capitalism does produce a party which in and of itself will only overturn that order when a revolutionary moment arises. One of my problems with this essay is that it seems to me to be kind of in this plodding way deterministic, and that that kind of historical materialist interpretation of the world, where it's capitalism is just through its own development going to overturn itself. It's kind of
that goes into the second part of the passage, right? Because the way it continues is capitalist society itself produces a communist party, which is nothing more than the organization of the objective movement. And my point is that, in fact, the Communist Party is the organization of the subjective movement, right? It's about the subjective position of the proletariat. It's about a space for developing and furthering class consciousness. It's that point where we have to recognize that the subjective moment is part of the objective moment, right? That consciousness is also part of our economic situation. So, I agree with you that with a kind of concern about what seems very much like a kind of determinism in this text.
Right. Yeah, and I see it there too. This question about the difference between the objective and the subjective, again, it's just opposition, and the two are intertwined. I had a comment here. This is exactly where I wanted to go in this conversation, is to this question about what they mean when they say objective moment, what you mean when you say that the party is subjective, and what Lacan or Zizek might say about what is objective and what is subjective. And you're referring to Zizek and Lacan in your call that the party is subjective. But first thing I wanted to say, and this is going to be just kind of silly sounding, but, for Lacan, the subject was barred. And it looked like a dollar sign when it was that way. And so I think the subject in our society is value, and not the real subject is value, the capitalist value, that surplus that we produce. That's the real subject. And I think that our identities and all of that are actually objective. They're not. They're actually, out there beyond us. They're always. It's that ego formation is always a reaction to what's going on around you, the society you're in, the people, the things you hear, the language that's being produced. I'm thinking about that. That's a really interesting thing to say. I think I totally disagree, but I'm also still really intrigued by it. And I don't disagree for theoretical reasons. I disagree for political reasons. So theoretically, it sounds totally interesting. Okay, so let me. I don't want to say that value is the subject or a subject. I would want to say that that valorization is the process inextricable for capitalism that is necessary to overcome in communism or eliminate in communism. That communism will not involve that kind of valorization, and so because I think that, I don't want to make valorization the subject, right? It seems to me, I can see why you would do that, right? It's like it's what moves in history would be a way to say that, but I think that that's not what moves in history. I think it's just the dynamic of capitalism, and that's a bad thing. And so so that's where I would go there, and then on the way I think about, I've been doing some more work these days on trying to understand subject and what it can mean. And the one place where I'm a little bit closer to you, though, is I'm thinking that that subject is always something collective. It's never another word for. It is when it's used as another word for individual. That's a mistake. That really anything that has a kind of agency or capacity to move or create or change would be already collective, or would be a collectivity, not something like an individual. So that's where actually there's a sort of similarity. I just don't want to capture subject there in valorization as its form, right? I would say that valorization would be what captures the subject rather than what is the subject. There's a typical Marxist...
Does that answer where you were...
It does. I understand exactly. I think I want to press it a little bit, but... Yeah. But there's a critique of Lacan that I've heard a lot, which is that he basically takes the psychology of capitalism, the dynamic of capitalism, and universalizes it. And that would be... If you think that when I say the subject is value, that the subject is also universal, that it... truly... And it has to be, right? That's almost... it seems like it's built into this idea, but if ahistorical and universal, then you don't want to call the dollar or value production or that part of the process of capitalism the subject. But I would just say that it's a symbolic subject, not the real subject.
Oh well, at this point. Yeah, at this point, I think we get into all sorts of complications with the symbolic and the real, and for the most part, I think Zizek is right here in again pointing out that these things, that symbolic, real, and imaginary, always intertwine with each other, and appear in multiple modes. So he even goes so far as to say there's a symbolic, imaginary, and real of the symbolic, imaginary, and real. So there's 9 different sort of ways to talk about intertwining of these components of subjectivity. Okay, so I would say I would first put it that way, and I actually think that when we think about valorization as a force that impacts us, even against all forms of its symbolization, I think it makes sense to think about it as a real force in our lives, as much, if not more, than a symbolic one. Like, real doesn't have to be ahistorical or anything like that. Real is just a kind of sort of rupturing or hole in what we are that will reappear in different ways. So there's all sorts of things can be real, like sexual difference is real, and class conflict is. There's a real antagonism, even as both of these things are symbolized and resist their own symbolization. That's what I would say about that.
Well, I'm not sure if I think that we're even disagreeing there, but I have to listen to what you said and think about it again, maybe when I'm editing this. But I just wanted to. I mean, we've talked for about 26 minutes, and so we only got a few minutes left, and. But do you now understand why I was interested in having this conversation a little bit?
Oh, sure, yeah. One of the other things you mentioned in your message to me was involving the issue of leaders, and we haven't been able to touch on that yet. Maybe we could say a little bit about that. In part, in the Communist Horizon, one of the things that I take from Occupy Wall Street and the way that Occupy Wall Street can give us insights into thinking about the party is to try to recognize both the issue of leaders as it appeared in Occupy Wall Street. Right, there was a kind of I would say just a crazed fear and paranoia about leaders. Yet, at the same time, leaders emerge, right? Leaders emerge for all sorts of reasons. Maybe because people have time, maybe because people have, a particular kind of skill set, maybe because just some people feel like doing something, and nobody else does. And what any I think political, let's call it what any political operation needs is a way to be explicit about the emergence of leaders and have the leaders be accountable. And I think that one of the things that a party can do, and that party has typically named, is an association that not only helps us a kind of the sort of subjective self-affirmation of the politics of a movement affirm itself, but it also lets forms of leadership within that affirmation and movement emerge and be made accountable. And I think that when we have a kind of radical politics that totally eschews being explicit about leadership, that we actually end up in some of the worst kinds of abuses. And so I hope that people will start thinking about how, what would it look like to have a party that we would like? What would it look like to have forms of political association, right? Association to fight for something better, that can be made accountable to our best ideas and our best energies.
I agree that this question of leadership is plagued the Occupy Wall Street. The strange thing is that it also plagues the left, Marxist left too. And this is what I mean. This is a question of the party reformed, and here's my thought about it. It was just that. I think that the question of leadership is maybe secondary to this question of subject. I mean, I think the Stalinist answer to the problem of how to overcome capitalism is to say you put leaders in the place of the economic drivers, that they're going to just discipline production themselves. The great leader will be there as the figure that motivates society, instead of this process of exploitation and value production. Okay, it's just a matter of the will and the will of the leader. And if you try to make a leadership based on that idea, you're going to have real problems. That's not going to work, and it's going to be a nightmare. But it's not as though that means leadership is the main problem. The reason it's a problem is because it's trying to do something and replace something that it can't and adequately replace. So I think that we have to ask this second question about value, as well as the question about leadership and the structure of organizations.
So what question do you want to say about value? I'm really curious about this. What to you is the significant and important issue of value? The
important issue of value is that we think we live in a world, and it tells you why we're having such difficulty making radical change when you start to understand value theory. Because the way I think of it, the value in society works like the unconscious. So to change the structure, the base of our society, you can't just, the ego can't do it. You have to, there's some other kind of work that has to be done. And I'm not saying we all lie down on the couch, but I'm just saying that we're needing to replace something that works right now as a political unconscious, as the economic. And that's really tricky, and it does require a lot of thought as well as action.
Okay, here's how I see it. I think that our primary problem is capitalism and the state that guarantees and supports it. And so the key is overthrowing or seizing this state and overturning the kinds of property relations that guarantee capitalism. And then next point is organizing production in good old-fashioned terms of from each according to ability to each according to need. Now, that is, as I understand it, all that's entailed in the rejection of value, right? The claim is that value is primarily exchange value, and so we have to get rid of that. And what does that mean? We have to get rid of the set of suppositions that tells us that, let's say, neurosurgery is worth 3 fancy cars, and so the same amount of money that pays for brain surgery will pay for 3 fancy cars, which seems actually really quite stupid, right? I mean, it seems like brain surgery is something that one completely needs, and 3 fancy cars are something that one never needs. And so that these are equated in our culturally submitted assumptions regarding exchange value is definitely wrong. But then if we were producing from each according to ability to each according to need, then we have solved this problem. And so the problem is not exchange, right? The problem is the assumption of production on the of producing for exchange, not producing for need.
Okay, here's my thought about that. Yeah, you're right that the problem there is that we have traded real value, use value, for exchange value, this abstraction. I mean, in economic terms, it makes perfect sense that neurosurgery and 3 Mercedes-Benz cost the same because they contain the same amount of labor time, right? So, which is an abstraction. So the problem is that we've allowed this abstraction to sit at the middle of in the realm of production. We don't produce for use, but okay. So it seemed like a simple thing. Just make what people need. Have everyone get together and cooperate to make what people need. But I think Lacan and Zizek can help here by pointing out that we need. One thing we need is this opposition. We actually need to produce for something other than ourselves. That we need that to survive. We can't just be one. We're always two. And so what we need is to find something that will do what value does, that will be this other thing, this abstraction that isn't based on survival basically isn't playing out in the realm of survival, and just we can take this problem up a notch and provide for everyone's needs, but still have some sort of split. And so
the version that I just described, I don't think there's any such thing as as eliminating the split, right? That's a fully reconciled world. I don't think it's the case, though, that the only way to account for the split is value. Old-fashioned Lacanian terms, what accounts for the split is our immersion in language, right? Desire gets caught in the signifier. Demand gets caught in the signifier. So I don't think that the problem is psychoanalytic in the sense that you're describing.
Well, that's fair enough. But I'm very happy to have been able to tell you about my idea.
Oh, cool! Yeah, it's really interesting. I look forward to seeing how you continue to develop it.
Right, and I'm open to this critique. And I think what you're saying there is that that you're uncomfortable with this putting the economic and shoving that into the realm of language. That it seems that split is more basic, and that and I can see that. I'm just kind of feeling this parallel or this. So anyway,
it's interesting. It'll be cool to see how you continue to develop it.
Our Father, which art in heaven,
humble words.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Trenchant words. Thundering.
Give me liberty. Give me liberty. Or give me death.
Thundering words.
The strongest word. The strongest word. The strongest word.
Persuasive.
The strongest word.
Expressive words.
The strongest word.
Inspirational words.
The strongest word is still the word free.
Grateful words.
Free.
Enlightenment words. Human words.
The word free. The strongest word is still the word free.
Men have lived for words.
Hysteria. Happy words.
Men have died for words.
Pointed words.
Cities have fallen for words.
Free.
The right words.
Iraq, inflammable.
The right words.
Islam, insidious.
The right words, said Lenin, are worth 100 regiments.
Impugn, infamous, correct.
Scathing words.
You can say 4 blunt words and a man will hit you in the face.
Words. Vitriolic words.
Sturdy, implacable,
Cramped. Sarcastic.
irreconcilable.
A little deluge of adjectives.
Words.
The strongest word is still the word free.
Impact, believability.
Next to the word free, the best word is new.
Persuasive words.
The best word is new.
At your 7-Eleven, freedom's waiting
For your kind of morning, it's our kind of freedom.
for you.
Other tested words are mistakes, stop, at last, and don't.